So this is my attempt to do clickbait. This is my video gaming setup. If you look carefully, you'll notice I've got kind of an odd gamepad configuration. Why am I doing that? The answer is it's the best thing I've been able to do to reduce my carpal tunnel pain. The idea is to reduce the amount of muscle activity that you have to use in order to be able to push buttons on the gamepad, to move the joysticks around, etc., and to reduce the amount of wear and tear on my right wrist, which is the one that has been giving me the most pain and suffering over the last few years while I've been playing video games. Of course, it's not just video games that causes trouble here, but it is the subject of this video, so we're going to ignore all the other activities that cause carpal tunnel pain and just talk about what we can do to reduce the amount of pain while playing video games. So in the previous video in this series, I talked about how you want to try to avoid holding the controller while you're playing your games. This is an extreme version of that. This is trying to reduce the amount of activity that my right hand needs to do in order to play video games, and also completely eliminate the need to hold anything. What I've done is I've got an exercise bike, and I've used GoPro attachments to attach these controllers at the ergonomic location that my hands naturally rest. This is just super fancy double-sided tape on the bottom of a generic Switch controller. And the beauty of this exercise bike is it already has a place to attach the handlebar GoPro attachment that you would use for mountain biking, I guess, with a GoPro or something like that. Same idea there. Now, what does this actually look like in practice? So let's demonstrate how this works for the left hand. The idea is to use this part of my palm to control the joystick, so I don't use my thumb at all, just use shoulder movements and forearm movements to control the joystick location, and that leaves these fingers here available for pushing buttons when necessary, although I try to minimize the amount of button pushes that I use with my right hand, just because my right hand is the one that's given me the most trouble. But if I have my hand resting on the joystick like this, it's really quite easy to push the shoulder button and trigger button on this side, and in a pinch I can definitely push these buttons too. Usually I have to sort of take your hand away to do that, but that's okay. My thumb is available to push these 4 buttons here that are specialized to a Switch controller, which is handy. That's why I use a Switch controller, even though it's for gaming with Steam. But the goal in general is to basically just control the joystick, if at all possible, with my right hand and do as little as possible otherwise, and make all of the button pushing happen with my left hand. And that's, again, what's great about these Switch controllers is they've got so many buttons on the top. With the left hand, it's basically just the same idea, resting your hand on this stick here and then doing as much as possible with the trigger button, bumper button, and the face buttons. So that's basically the key of it from a hardware perspective, trying to reduce the amount of muscle activity, trying to keep everything at an ergonomic location, and trying to shift as much of the work as possible to the hand that is the least affected by carpal tunnel syndrome. Of course, there's also a software component that we'll talk about next. So this is the software that I use. It's called reWASD. It is a bit of a challenge to set up, but it features a killer amount of customization. In particular, it's very happy to take multiple input devices, in this case 2 gamepads, and map each of the gamepads differently onto a single virtual Xbox 360 controller. So right now we're looking at my left gamepad mapping, and you'll notice that I've done things like set up these 2 face buttons here so that they work as trigger buttons, and they are toggle trigger buttons. In other words, I don't have to actually keep them depressed in order for the game to think they're depressed. When you push them once, they toggle on. You push them again, they toggle off. That's really good because it, again, reduces the amount of muscle activity you need in order to be able to squeeze the trigger for a prolonged period of time. If we look at the mapping for the other gamepad, I have a completely different set of mappings for those 4 Switch-specific controllers. Plus, I've also mapped to this D-pad to 1, 2, 3, 4. That's because it's very handy for playing first-person shooters to be able to switch amongst the different weapons directly, and that's almost always mapped to 1 through 8. But if we go back to the other gamepad, you can see that I still have complete access to a regular D-pad for when I need it. Another thing that you can do with reWASD that's pretty handy is to adjust the sensitivity of each of the analog sticks. Since you have 2 gamepads, there's no reason why the analog sticks need to behave identically between the 2 of them. In particular, it can often be really handy to make precise movements with one of the sticks and fast movements with the other. So if we look at the adjustment for this particular stick, I have set the response so that it saturates at a fairly small amount of deviation, which allows me to make very precise movements with just the right stick on just the left gamepad. The other gamepad, everything is adjusted as normal. This means that I can do precise aiming with a gamepad. It's not as precise as with a mouse, but it's still much improved. And obviously this is all aimed at being able to play fairly twitch-heavy games like first-person shooters. I'm not going to be able to play competitively against someone with a keyboard and mouse, at least not in the wild and woolly world of the internet, although I can still, hold my own in a LAN party with your average Joe Schmo competitors. That would be just about murder on my hands to be able to try and play a game like that with a keyboard and mouse. But this setup I can play for an hour or something like that without causing undue harm. So reWASD is not the cheapest software, nor is it the easiest to use, but it does seem to have more power in terms of the configuration options than any of the competitors out there. And when you consider how debilitating wrist pain can be and how expensive surgery can be, it's worth spending the money, I think, to try and mitigate the harm that you're doing to your wrist. I really wish that I had started down this path 5 years ago, because now all I can do is really slow down the progression rather than prevent it from happening in the first place. But the end result is I am able to play games for, a couple hours a day if I want to, without really hurting myself. And that's definitely been very valuable. I might also point out that this is all built on top of an exercise bike platform, which means that I can argue that I'm actually doing my heart good playing video games. I'm getting a little bit of exercise, raising my pulse, etc., etc. So I think that this is actually a pretty good way to play video games. You'll notice that the idea that video games should be a form of exercise is something that my household really believes in, but DDR is only one type of game. This can allow a lot of different types of games. So I highly recommend this both from a carpal tunnel perspective and also just from a lifestyle perspective. And I hope that my ideas and success here are inspiration for other folks who are facing similar problems.